The idea of how you could create value in a business engaged me, which led to how do you value business, which led me to how should you calculate what a business is worth, which led me to how do you figure out when you are no longer the best person to hold that business, and that this was a time to realize the value that was created. So I bought lots and lots and lots of companies and sold lots and lots. Brian Barefoot, a past president of Babson and a fraternity brother of mine, said to me a few years ago, you know something, you were never an operating executive. You were an investment banker in disguise. And part of that is true.
Bob was terrific at acquisition and acquisition management. Bob understood the art of a deal. Bob understood how to financially get it across. He understood the emotional purchase of an asset, but always was willing to walk away from a deal if it didn't meet the criteria and the frameworks that Bob felt were necessary to complete an acquisition or a transaction. When Bob looked at acquisitions, he wanted to buy assets that would be enduring. That meant he wanted technologies, he wanted capabilities, he wanted brand. Clearly the people that managed those assets are important and were important to Bob. But Bob did not go in saying, I'm going to buy a company because of its people first, and then look at its capabilities, brand, technology. So Bob's guiding principles around acquisition, number one, is that it had to be future-looking and meet what would be an emerging technology, potential technology need in the marketplace. Number two, it had to be well-run. So from an operational standpoint, he was not burdened by bringing on something that needed an operational turnaround. And thirdly, clearly, he wanted great value, but he also understood that acquisitions are win-win situations, that they do not happen unless both sides feel like they've walked away with a victory. And so Bob balanced that as he did the financial aspects of any acquisition.
People respond to their incentives. Why did that person do that? That doesn't make any sense. Well, using this simple test in my mind helped me to understand how people responded, why they responded in the way that they did. And I've had no reason to change that over the years. Anything is reinforced.
I don't think Bob was ever cutthroat in business, but he was very smart. He knew how the business world worked, and he knew how to get what he wanted without hurting anybody else.
What you ideally would like to do is to understand what is in their interests, what they care about. Because if you can do that, you're not selling to them, they're buying from you.
His ego wasn't really what drove him, and I think that he made everything seem, that it's to the benefit of the other person.
In the middle of 1994, I was sitting with the chairman at International CSS, talking about the quarterly earnings, which weren't going to be good, and what the company could say to Wall Street about those earnings. And I said to the chairman the following. I said, Dick, what we're talking about is a symptom. Let's talk about the problem. The problem is that you have lost the confidence of your troops. Your reputation with them is very low. And unless we correct that, will never solve the problem of the earnings call. And you should think about that. And if you decide that you can't fix it, you ought to retire and let somebody else do the job. And he looked at me and he said, you're not the first person to tell me that. And I said, well, take that as an indication that there's some validity to what I told you. He said, well, in fact, I've had some people say that I should retire and name you CEO. What do you think of that? Well, by the way, was 41 years old. So I said, Dick, I've got to think about that. I can't respond to that. And I walked out of his office, and ego won as I thought about it. I came back in to his office a few days later and said, okay, I'm a player. 6 months later, I was the CEO.
He sold our company, National CSS, to Dun & Bradstreet about 15 hours before the computer time-sharing business, which was what Dun & Bradstreet was in, fell apart and went away, began to deteriorate, never to be heard of again.
We had just gone from a $50 million a year to $110 million. Business is going pretty well. But I had seen the future. I had gone on the board of a little company that was the first personal computer retail outlet in the country. I had built my first computer 5 years earlier, and it was not a useful tool. But here this company has these computers being made by little companies out west, and I saw what was going to happen, and I saw what was going to happen to the cost curve of things like what we did. And then I found out that Dun & Bradstreet had made an attempt to acquire a competitor of mine a year earlier, and had said to my general counsel, I want you to track Dun & Bradstreet and all its filings and send me a report on a regular basis. I want to know who they are, what they're doing, where they are. So by the time the chairman of Dun & Bradstreet called me up, it was not a surprise. I knew exactly what their interests were. I knew how much they had offered to pay for my competitor. I had all the advantages in the world. This was a 140-year-old company, and it was in many ways sclerotic, as only a market share dominant company can be.
He went into an old established corporate thing and said, this isn't going to work. We got to do something. And I can't imagine the flack he got up front from all these people that have been there for 100 years, and this is how we do it, and that's how we're going to do it. And he goes, not anymore. Not anymore.
D&B decided it wanted to understand itself better, and it hired Bain & Company as a strategic consulting company to come in and evaluate its various businesses. The majority of D&B upper management fought this tooth and nail. They hated the idea. They felt threatened by the idea. Bob, and I made this evaluation very early on. I sat and I watched him do this. I could almost read his mind. He saw it as an opportunity, and whatever he thought of Bain and what they could bring to D&B, he was smart enough to know that Duke Drake and Charlie Moritz wanted this done. So he cooperated. He was just smart enough to see that as an opportunity. Now, I'm not suggesting that the only reason he became, in effect, COO and then CEO of Dun & Bradstreet was because of that, but that was a big part of it.
I was at Dun & Bradstreet. I was running my division of Dun & Bradstreet. Reuben H. Donnelly was in the business of selling advertising for Yellow Pages and publishing the Yellow Pages on behalf of telephone operating companies around the country. We had been doing this for decades. The contracts were 10-year contracts. We had a contract coming up for renewal with what was then called Ameritech, a telephone operating company responsible for the old Bell system in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. It was a sizable contract. They had advised the company that they did not intend to renew it, that they were going to take it in-house and do it themselves. The chairman, and this was at a time when a fellow named Duke Drake was the chairman, was in his office talking to an outside lawyer about this problem. And the lawyer said, "Let me ask you a question. Who's the best negotiator in Dun & Bradstreet?" The chairman said, "That would be Bob Weissman." He said, "Well, this is the most important negotiation you've ever faced. Why don't you have your best negotiator working on it?" That really struck a chord with the chairman, who a couple of minutes later came down to my office, said, "This is going on in this business, which I was not involved in. I would like you to take over the negotiations." I took it over, started commuting to Chicago. 6 weeks in, we had made enough progress that they were suing us. I said to our Chicago lawyer, "Do you know someone at the Commerce Commission in Illinois, which was the agency responsible for oversight to the phone companies and did such things as set the rates for the phone companies?" He said, "Yes, we do know some people." I said, "Can you set up a meeting for us with the commissioner?" He said, "Let me see." He came back, he said, "Commissioner is willing to meet, but says he does not want to meet with just you. He wants to meet with you and the Ameritech folks, the phone company folks." Fair enough. So we have a meeting. The chairman of the commission turns to Ameritech and says, "I know that you're involved in a legal battle now. Appreciate it if you tell me why you can't work it out." Well, of course, the lawyers on that side had spent a lot of time figuring out how to answer that question before it was asked. They knew that would be a question. And so they came up with a list of reasons why we would not agree. As not that they were being obstinate, but that we could not agree, and laid that out for him. And he turned to me and he said, "What's your response to that?" And I gave him a big smile and I said, "Well," I said, "I've got to tell you, I have misunderstood the position of Ameritech by a lot, and I apologize for it, but based on what they said, I think we have a deal. I think we can work out all the details." And he said, "That's terrific. I'm glad I was able to help." And that was the end of the meeting. And we walked out, and my lawyer who was there said, "What the hell did you just do? You know you can't agree to those things." I said, "I know. But guess what happens to them if a deal doesn't happen? Who's the commissioner going to punish? Not me. I'm gone. Them. They have to do a deal with us." And that's what happened. And a deal which was delivering $20 million a year in profit became a deal which in the first year delivered $50 million and grew to $200 million over the life of the contract.
He has more humanity than any business person I've ever met. I've worked for people that were just absolute bastards. Absolute bastards. And I know Bob has done some difficult things in his past. He said firing people is really, really hard, but as an executive, you gotta do it. Not just for the company, but for the person too. You gotta say, you gotta move on and find something that you really wanna do, because this isn't it.
The guy who was named chairman, my boss, I said to him one day, Charlie, you and I need to have a career talk, because I was 52 and he was 58. I said, if you intend to be chairman till you're 65, I will be too old to take the job. You know we do not have anyone else in the organization who is likely to be ready. So you need to decide if you're going to retire early or stay on till 65. Because if you do, then we need to go outside and bring in the people who have the potential to replace you. And I'm happy to stay here and help you do that. And he went off and thought about it. And then he went to his directors and said to them, I'm going to retire at age 58. And they said, why? And the directors then started calling me, saying, what's going on with Charlie? Because they would ask him, why now, Charlie? Well, you have to listen to the small voice within, was his answer, which didn't compute, but that's what happened. He retired and I became chairman.